I do think that there are alternatives. I said earlier in this comment, I think it's a bad mistake to separate out Civil War from Reconstruction. When are we going to commemorate Reconstruction? It's all right if we've got a statue of Wade Hampton. Let's put a statue up to Robert Smalls, much greater hero, stood for the right things, as Civil War hero as well as a Reconstruction. South Carolina is noted for, as best I can tell, changing the history of the state in two ways. One was the Civil War, but also Brown v. Board started here in Clarendon, South Carolina, not Topeka, Kansas. Those folks have never been recognized, and they suffered. They are true heroes that fought that good fight for their children out of Clarendon, South Carolina. You don't see a statue of Reverend Delaney there on the State House grounds. There are other ways, I think, that we can really do it. And as I said, when we think of the Civil War, I think we should think of Reconstruction to commemorate. There, we actually had, in the state of South Carolina, an interracial legitimate government overthrown by a coup, an illegal coup, through violence. That's part of, I think, the commemoration that needs to come about to deal with our truth in this.
Nearly a decade ago, and Dr. McPherson helped us, just for us as an agency, to say publicly that slavery was one of the central tenets of the Civil War. And for us to be able to say that, I think, was a great victory for the agency. And I think in many respects, that became a foundation for us now to even deal with the next 4 years plus. And one of the things I didn't share with you, our whole thought and theme of this process is actually from Civil War to civil rights. So this is a long-lasting journey that we find ourselves in. I think it's important that we in the history community that are purveyors of the history, that we have ourselves together first before we go out to disseminate to the general public. And what that means is that we as employees or staff people bring all kind of biases and issues and isms to our place of employment. That's a reality. But at the end of the day, there's a fact and a history that we have to project that's a part of the narrative of our site. And so I know for us, we had to do some soul searching. And that soul searching that we did allowed us to at least begin to look at things in a whole different context. So I think to answer your question, yes, there is fact and there's fiction and there's mythical system all out there that we will have to come back over the course of the next 4.5 years.
It's also really important, this is why I think we have to keep this war in mind, to know that tens of thousands of enslaved women died in battle or on battlefields or in camps that were set up by the Union Army. So there's a lot to the story that hasn't gotten into the history books and that I think needs to be told. And I'm not at all convinced either that the South African method of dealing with these problems is the best way either for South Africa or for the U.S. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has left, it got some people to come forward and say, I did some very bad things, but it didn't really resolve anything. You go to South Africa today, and white people are living behind barbed wire. So that, to me, suggests a fundamentally unresolved a problem in South Africa. But anyway, I could go on and on. So.
You pointed out the sort of terrible ersatz Mickey Mouse commemoration is the opposite of preservation, which is something that the questioner just brought up really is what are the next 4 years about? It's about, I feel, the preservation of memory and the preservation of Civil War artifacts and places and experiences. And that's different from commemoration, but it's linked to it. And I think actually the vital argument, and that's what really must be done in the next 4 years. And we have this opportunity right now to do it.
Jack
Thompson, I'm a tour guide. Okay, you have said things we should commemorate. Slavery, one of the causes, civil rights, Geeches are involved, sleeping in cabins. What are other things that we should commemorate or which we should forget? Specific things.
Well, now, of course, I'm not speaking for the whole panel here. We should certainly commemorate Robert Smalls and all that he did. When you commemorate Robert Smalls, you not only commemorate the commandeering of the planter and selling himself, other family members, and other slaves to freedom, but you also get an opportunity to bleed into that Reconstruction story through Robert Smalls. We get an opportunity to talk about Harriet Tubman, the fact that she spent time in this state on Morris Island, on the Combahee. In fact, I got a phone call just last week from a young lady from a plantation never heard of, Numerous Plantation. Have you ever heard of that? It's Numerous. Thank you for correcting my pronunciation. And she said, we own this property, and we saw what you were doing with these slave dwellings, and we acquired this property. It was owned by the DuPonts. We acquired this property, this 10,000 acres, just for a honey preserve. But, you know, there are dwellings on this property that can tell the story of slavery, and we want you to come here and advise. So that's something else that we can certainly commemorate.
And he was talking about plantations, particularly in what's become the Ace Basin, down the Asheboro-Cumbie rice plantation, Edisto. And he was pointing out that, you know, well, we go to the bank at Plantation Federal, but we never go to the bank at Slave Labor Camp Federal. we go eat at the, you know, Plantation Grill, but I don't think we'd stop at, you know, Slave Labor Camp Grill. And
Drayton Hall Elementary School.
Excuse me?
Like Drayton Hall Elementary School.
Drayton Hall Elementary School, thank you. What a school Drayton Hall was for the children who lived there 150 years ago. And so there's a, you know, what should be the role of historians, people like us? What can we do to have more truth in advertising, more truth, you know, on the sites? It's very difficult. And even bringing it into museums, especially because it's true that people do not get their history from schools. They get their history outside, mainly outside of schools, at sites, television. But when we're in schools, you know, that's one place we can affect. And yet, the state of Texas has just eliminated the word slave trade from all its textbooks, because there was no more slave trade. There was an Atlantic trade. You know, there was no slave trade. So part of what we're talking about are political problems, and the problems of people who are in the positions, you know, to affect what gets taught in these kind of different venues. And we are at the universities, at the colleges, where we're nice and safe and comfortable, and where we lament that our books, or, you know, don't get out to, the lessons of the books, you know, don't reach more people.
I wonder if part of the problem in remembrance isn't that young scholars in particular, in academia, their work is published in increasingly electronic formats in obscure journals that are hidden in extremely expensive databases that are not available to people, and they're forced to do this because of what I would consider a broken tenure system in the university. And I'm not talking about necessarily just getting out and speaking to SCD groups or going into hostile environments, but recognizing that all of us bristle at the idea that we don't live in the real world and we're trapped behind, you know, in some ivory tower, but then our work that we produce in many ways, that's exactly where it stays. And, you know, but, I mean, this has been going on in these discussions, and I keep hearing things about sort of reconciliation and tolerance. I mean, it might just be my own personal feelings, but I'm kind of getting a little bit intolerant of accepting this notion that, you know, it's states' rights, not slavery. I mean, no one has argued that for decades, and yet we're not getting through.
But this is clearly a problem for white people, right?
Right.
I mean, and I think if we're going to be really honest today, we have to just recognize that this is a problem for white people, that white people are having a problem trying to figure out what the war was about, and black people are not, and have not, from the moment the war ended and even before. Black people understood very clearly what their sacrifice had been about. You've got women in March, Arkansas, in the most deadly place during Reconstruction, who are Black women who are, working after their work to decorate the graves of Union soldiers from the North and Black soldiers. You've got right up the road here in Pineville, South Carolina, people remember this woman named Rosa, who was murdered by Confederate troops in 1865 on March 26 because she was leading a band of local slaves against the local slaveholders. And so I think we ought to be really, really clear and careful about what we're trying to do here and what we're not trying to do here. I do think, as well, having grown up in Columbia, surrounded by Civil War monuments and been bused down to Charleston every year to Fort Sumter when I was a child, that I think the problem is not necessarily putting up more monuments to Black people. The problem is not necessarily, and I admire you, but I couldn't do that. Befriend necessarily people who work against my own interest and the interest of history. So it's just very, very complicated. I just have to say that because that never comes up, it seems to me. And one final thing. I do, and I know many other scholars who do work beyond the academy, whether that's, speaking with, organizing kids in the community, writing papers that aren't going to get you promoted, or articles that aren't going to get you promoted, at 3 a.m. because you've got to do it. That ivory tower doesn't have to be either right or a barrier to our getting out.
In general, but not always, the way Britain's involvement is remembered over here is completely different from the way it's remembered in Great Britain. So the first reason it's important is these two very different memories, these two different and parallel stories have to be reconciled. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think sometimes there's a note of victimhood in accounts, northern accounts of how the international world reacted to the North, and which I think absolutely has to be addressed. It's because it goes to the heart of hypocrisy, and I think it does actually go to the heart of some of the arguments that keep on going round and round in circles in general here. That the North is not a victim. It's many things. It is indeed not a victim, and so just for that reason alone. Accepting culpability, accepting responsibility, and accepting going to the heart of hypocritical movements is the reason why we have to keep on studying this war in this country and in Britain.
And if I were a tour guide in Charleston, if you have the interest of history at heart in mind, I would get numbers for the wealth that was produced on the rice fields to build the houses of Charleston. I would tell everybody who comes, this house cost this much when it was built. Here's what the family made, and here's how they made it. I would keep all of that at the forefront. I'm a big believer also in public art, I think, and guerrilla art. I think there ought to be movable statues that are taken around of people who were there working as slaves all over the place, and they can be moved because they will be taken away. But I think if I were a local artist, I would want to contribute to history in that way. So I would get outrageous, but I would not let any tourist come here without knowing why this city is so beautiful and who really built it, whose labor built it.
you know, when they first come, it's often at the airport, and if you think about what we have there,
Yes.
it's the beautiful ironwork
Right,
Simmons,
right.
and then we have the baskets. And so before they even get into the city, the
Absolutely.
thing is set. That's where it has to begin, at least for the outsider.
Yes.
And then kids pick that up too.
Just going to add to your question, besides the academic world that have done, like you said, an excellent job in putting this out, but it seems to be like hidden in plain view. I think there's another, I use the word culprit in this whole conversation, and that's the historic sites themselves and the magical stories they've been telling for years and things that they've been projecting that was clearly opposite to the history of the site. So, and I'm clear on saying that because I've been around long enough to know the magical stories that have been told at historic sites over the last 30 years or so. And so I think a part of our work also has been engaging them. I think what we've heard here is that the schools are foundations to help project this history. But then the schools will tell you, or the teachers will tell you that we are unsure, we're uncomfortable, or we're unable. So where's the next place besides home and your family structure? So these are these historic sites. So when you go there, they're unsure, they're uncomfortable, or they're unable. And so we all have this virus now. And so again, I think as we go through this 150th journey, then we also have to double back and talk to our historic sites because they also help to pervade and they will be helping to tell these stories as well.
I never heard of the war growing up until a little bit in high school. You know, there was a few battles. Antietam, that was Gettysburg, that was the really important, right? You know, and the war that we knew was World War II. That was the war. But one thing that we also knew was the struggle of African Americans to realize their rights. So I also grew up like 3 blocks from Ebbets Field, where the Brooklyn Dodgers played. And so the really important events of my childhood were when Jackie Robinson stole the base, or that was. But the kind of the history, particularly the history of black people that we were taught, was really almost through Ralph Ellison called Invisible Man, Invisible History. But suddenly these people who had been kept apart from us as well in Brooklyn, New York, were coming into kind of the center of life, and were exciting all of us, and we were all cheering for them. You know, and there was great confusion among, particularly if you ask your parents, you know, Mom, Dad, where are they from? You know, where, you know, some of these people are in my school now. You know, what, it was, so the teaching of it and Civil War, for me, really began in college. And it began, interestingly enough, not with a book about the Civil War, but the publication of a book called Slavery in the late 1950s by Stanley Elkins. A book came out called Slavery. No one knew what was slavery. We had slavery in this country. And here was a book that was, you know, for 75 years, that was basically U.B. Phillips and American Negro slavery and life and labor on the plantations. That was slavery. That did it. That was the corner for it. But even the book, even Elkins' book on slavery was inspired by his reading of the concentration camps. So that too, so suddenly for me, there was a linkage between, the history of Jewish people and the history of black people. You know, so I take that as a kind of just a personal link that kind of led me more into, kind of an exploration of the Civil War. But the Civil War too was taught in, for example, I can remember a first course on the Civil War at Amherst College. It was taught quite apart from history. It was taught as the Civil War, which was up there, not kind of in the flow of American history. You know, now in the sense, I think that it is taught everywhere as in kind of a fulcrum that which separates, and it serves at the university to separate semesters. You know, we teach up to the Civil War, and then that's how American history is divided. You know, kind of the modern times and previously. But there's some truth in that it is kind of the fulcrum upon which the history turns.
You know, I think why people are interested, we look to the Civil War for our identity. It was the deadliest war in our history. More Americans killed, particularly proportionally, and things like that. But it's also about the place of African Americans in this little R, republic democracy. In other words, I think you can write that larger and say, what is the place of people perceived as different in a republic or a democracy? And I think that's why we'll always be fascinated. But also I think there's an international concern as well, because Lincoln, when you mentioned Gettysburg, Lincoln really did not only redefine the war with the new birth of freedom, but he redefined what liberty meant. He redefined liberty so the rest of the world could really be inspired by more than what we had thought of and had lived before. I like to think that Lincoln took a document he really was inspired by, the Declaration of Independence, and actually put it into the Constitution, so that for the first time you have personal liberty, freedom, and things guaranteed by this Constitution, this rule of law that we live by. And that changed, I think, the way the world thought about liberty and freedom. Just something for you to think about, and you'll have to come back. When is it, Simon? What year? 2013. We'll see you all right back here in the